Whether you're working part-time or full-time, or you're just preparing to enter the workforce, gender discrimination is a topic that you should be mindful of. But today, we want to dig in a little bit deeper than just regulations and laws and talk about our experiences and just reflect on the issue in general. Welcome back to another episode of Hanging in the Imbalance. I am your co-host, MJ.
And I'm Samantha.
On today's episode, gender discrimination at workplace.
Hello everyone, I'm Samantha. I'm year 4 student studying accounting and finance. I had an internship jobs in both government office and also private companies, but so far I haven't experienced such an issue of gender inequality in the workplace. And how about you, MJ? Have you experienced that before?
Yeah, so just like you, I'm a year 4 student here at the University of Hong Kong. I'm majoring in molecular biology and biotechnology. And, well, quote unquote, I'm a woman in science. With my experiences in the workforce so far, I have worked in startups, I worked for the university, for some researchers, and I have also worked in companies in non-biotech related fields. And I think generally my experience have been very positive. But I do have a few things that I can talk about. But I think maybe we should comment a little bit about our backgrounds as well. So I'm Iranian and I'm Muslim. And I think that sometimes maybe being a Middle Eastern woman in science, so maybe that's something that I thought I have to fight for. Like, this is my going against the stereotypes. But generally, I think I haven't had that experience yet. Like, people aren't like, oh my God, you're a woman in science? Oh my God, you are a Middle Eastern woman in science. You're Muslim, but you're like a scientist. So I haven't had that experience yet. How about you? Because I know you're doing business and accounting. So have you ever felt out of space being a Hong Kong person?
I haven't experienced that before, but it's really good to hear that being a science student and STEM student, you're really proud of yourself and getting recognition from other people. It's really exciting to hear that we're living in such a diverse place, no matter which race you are, which region you are from.
Yeah. So I think I feel like one of the best parts about Hong Kong is that it's so diverse. And so that's why I feel like, and also it has something to do with our faculty as well. Like, when I came in, I was so surprised that I think I have the equal number of female and male professors. So I think that was something that I was really surprised about. So before coming into science, I think I did think that, I actually never knew there's a stereotype that women aren't in STEM. Like, I just grew up not knowing about it until like I was almost graduating high school. So then coming into uni, I was kind of mindful about that. But when I came in, I was like, oh, in my experience, it doesn't exist, thankfully. Girls, I don't know. I feel like it's kind of stupid to say it, but like, girls are better in arts and history, boys are better in like science and engineering. But I mean, from my experience, I didn't feel that way. Yeah, I felt very welcomed.
This is an old thinking.
When I was doing research for this episode, I decided to do some reflection on my own experiences. Like, have I ever had a chance or like a case that I feel like, oh, maybe I was gender discriminated against? And I had to think really, really hard. And I came across this one instance that I felt like something like that happened. But not to say that it was the employer necessarily, but I felt like, oh, if I were a guy, maybe I could have gotten this opportunity. So the story goes like this. I was applying for a part-time lab technician position, and it was at a factory, and basically what you had to do is do some quality tests on these products. And so I was really excited. I thought it's good. Like, I want to do a part-time work, and I was still in school. I was like year 3, and I thought it was a perfect opportunity. And so I applied for it, and I went for the interview. And the sketchy thing about this thing is that it was a factory, right? But it was so far away from the city. It was near Shenzhen, okay? Like, it was about an hour and like 45 minutes or like almost 2 hours away from my home. And when I pulled up, it was kind of like the village side. So I felt like I could look over and I'll see Shenzhen. Like, that's how close it was. So for me, it was pretty far. But it was also like a very deserted area. So there weren't many people around. I had to take like if I were to go, I had to take like a minibus and they would drop you off somewhere. There's really no one around. It's like an industrial area. And so I went into the factory and I had an interview with the guy, and like he showed me around. Everything's fine. Like, the job is easy enough, etc., etc. And right there and then, I was like, okay, I don't think I can do this. It's too far. The pay isn't good. It's kind of sketchy. Like, what if I'm coming here early in the morning? There's already no one around. And like when I'm leaving late at night or like even leaving at 6, that's something like as girls, we are concerned about, right? This is a deserted area. Like, am I safe here? Then I was like, okay, I'm not going to do this job regardless. And then I came home and the guy also messaged me. He was like, I don't think this is a suitable position for you. And I was like, yeah, sure, totally understand. But when I was reflecting back on this, I was thinking, if I were a guy, would I still have the same worries I have as a girl? Like worrying about my safety, worrying about, going to like somewhere so far where there's no one. So yeah, this isn't necessarily a case of gender discrimination, but I think it's one instance that I was like, if I were a guy, I don't think I would have the same concerns.
Honestly speaking, it's so hard to put yourself into the position of another, especially for different genders. But if it is one of the job requirements that you have to travel to that far away place to have your research job, then you have to do so no matter you are a male or a female. If we think about it from this point, it seems not constitute as a gender discrimination, but from a male side, a girl having to travel far away from another place to a place with few people and even unfamiliar, this gives me a sense of gender inequality.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think it's gender discrimination. And it's like, I think the reason the employee didn't give me the job is nothing to do with my gender. I think it was more because like he didn't see me fit for the position, like to come back, travel such a long time, etc. But I feel like it is a case of gender inequality because that's how I felt. Like I'm like, I feel like I'm qualified, but because my position as a woman, I feel like I don't feel comfortable to take this,
Have you spoke out?
No, it's definitely a personal thing. Like, I'm sure there are other girls, they wouldn't feel the same. They'll be like, oh, this is fine for me. I don't feel threatened in this place. But yeah, I feel like that was my little tiny gender inequality moment that I'm like, damn it, if I was a guy, if I were a boy,
yes,
something like that. Yeah. Anyway, so that was my experience. And I think now we want to test you and test ourselves a little bit, see how familiar are we with gender discrimination cases at the workplace. So right now, Samantha is going to read us some of the cases that she found that are real in this world, that really happened. And I'm going to be blind reacting to it. And so are you. So think about how you would have reacted in this situation and just let us know how you feel.
MJ, I've heard of a case in Hong Kong. In November 2021, a woman claimed she was sexually harassed several times at work by her former male colleague. The harasser stroked her back with his hands and even stared at her chest as her clothes got wet from the rain. And if it were you, what would you do in this situation?
So the guy looked at her inappropriately, made her uncomfortable, and he also physically like touched her back.
And also stared at her chest when the clothes got wet.
Did this happen like several times, or
Yes.
was it just when it was raining?
Several times.
Well, actually, firstly, even if it was just one time, it's totally inappropriate. I feel like with my personality, I would snap back at him. I'd be like, what are you looking at, or something like that.
Yes, you would definitely spoke out.
Yeah, right away. But also, depends who it is. Like, if it's just a colleague on the same level, I would snap back, right? But if it's my supervisor, I feel like, oh, wait, I have to think about it. If it's a supervisor or someone like my boss, like, I
think I would do the same way as you. I would spoke out and say no. And of course, verbally warn him. If the weather forecast that it might rain, I would probably take additional piece of clothing to change to avoid such opportunities for harassers. And if the harasser's behavior continued, I would speak to my supervisor or my boss. But it would be the case that the same level employees doing the thing to me.
But you know what's the part that's tricky about this is that in a lot of these cases, it's very ambiguous. Like, you don't know. First time it happens, you're like, is he really looking at me? Like, or am I just, okay, I'm making this up, okay? Like, And then the second time, you're like, oh no. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes it's like, it's easy to say that we would take these actions, but I'm thinking like, honestly, if it's like supervisor, would I be comfortable to be like, hey, So
Yes.
it's a tricky situation. What did you do?
Later on, Equal Opportunities Commission, on behalf of this woman, C, filed a claim in the district court under the Sex Discrimination Ordinance, Chapter 480 of Laws of Hong Kong. Therefore, if we cannot address this problem of such gender discriminatory harassment by ourselves, we may consider seeking help from the Equal Opportunity Commission, filing a legal aid complaint.
So she took this issue, she filed a complaint in Equal Opportunity Commission.
Yes.
And they helped her to pursue it. Do you have any information on what was the outcome? Like what happened after? Did they announce what did the court say? No, so they didn't have any information on that. But they only said that she filed it, right?
Yes.
My biggest opinion on this is that it seems like on the spectrum of like sexual harassment or like gender discrimination in workplace, I feel like the spectrum of this is quite low, right? So if an issue that is seemingly, quote unquote, seemingly not a great issue can't be resolved within the company, that you have to take it out to Equal Opportunity Commission, imagine the cases that are so severe, then how are you supposed to deal with those? Like, you know what I mean? It's kind of like making me question like how to deal with that.
So this issue is complex in the sense that everyone is saying what they're looking at, they feel, but no one is recording this moment and no one gives evidence to what is actually happening and what constitutes a sexual harassment. And no one even knows. That guy stares at the woman. Is he really staring at her chest? The issue can hardly find a balance between who to support. How can we identify a harasser or not? The whole complaint is undergoing a hard situation.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So maybe he could argue that I wasn't looking at you, I was just looking at your direction. Like, what do you have to say for yourself? How are you accusing me of like sexually harassing you? I was just looking in your direction. And I think maybe situations like this will kind of discourage girls to come out and like fight for what they think is right. And so that's why I think it's important we bring up this point that there are some grounds for when you think you're being genderly discriminated. So when we were doing research, we found that some of the examples that are offered by this workplace equality, equalrights.org, and they're an advocate for equal rights at the workplace. And one of the examples they said is that being subject to unwelcomed sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. But they also mentioned that everything that makes you feel uncomfortable is valid for you to report. So it's, although, yeah, like maybe the guy wasn't like doing it with that intention, but it made you feel uncomfortable regardless. You feel that you're being gender discriminated against, and then there you have a case. You don't have to be thinking like, oh, but what is he going to say? It's about you. I feel uncomfortable. I feel like something was done that wasn't right. I can tell the intention and I'm going to report it, you know? Maybe not necessarily to Equal Opportunity Commission right away, but I still have grounds to fight for this. But also, if we think about it from the other perspective, what if it's a girl looking at a guy? How do you think the situation would be different?
We often talk about that for men, they have a good body figure. If others look at the male, it seems not constitute a gender discrimination or gender inequality because we just feel appreciated and feel pleasure to look at a good body figure.
There's like a double standard when it comes to girls and guys. Like when it comes to especially things like looking at each other or whatever, it seems like the stakes for a guy to consider something gender discrimination is higher. But that's toxic, right? Like you mentioned, a lot of the times, like especially when it comes to like K-pop idols or just good-looking men, girls are like, I don't know if you heard of this term, like eye candy or something, like, you know, quote unquote eye candy. And yeah, like if a guy, the way if a girl would look at a guy and be like, oh, I enjoy the way his body looks. But if a guy do that and even openly admit that I like the way this girl's body looks, so I'm going to look at it, then people are going to be like, oh my God, like this is inappropriate, right? So that's why it makes me think like if it was a guy in this case, maybe he wouldn't report it because he maybe, even though if he feel uncomfortable that he's been subjected to being looked at in like an inappropriate, unprofessional way, but he still wouldn't maybe take it up a notch because he would be like, I mean, he wouldn't bring it up to the authorities because he would feel like she's just looking, you know. I don't think there's much I can do about that.
The point is when someone is treated unequally or make you feel disadvantaged or discomfortable because of their gender, that would be the gender inequality. So if the guys think, oh, you look at me, but I still feel pleasure because I feel proud of myself that my body attracts you to pay more attention on me, I don't think this is a kind of gender inequality, but if the guys think, oh, I feel so bad, if you stare at me, that would be the gender inequality.
And so at the end of the day, it's about your
Personal experience.
your personal experience.
Yeah.
How do you interpret the outcome?
Can we hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Okay, good. Okay, so I just want to interject here for a moment because I know I came along as the engineer today, and my job today is to record the two of you. And as I've been listening to this conversation from the perspective of a 54-year-old white man, who's a teacher, who deals with females on a regular basis, and part of my job is I have to be present with female students. Today we're here in my office, and it's me and the two of you. Now, as you've been talking, as I've been thinking through this scenario, I'm trying to picture it from my perspective. Now, there's a couple of things happening here. Number one, the concept that whatever makes you feel uncomfortable, right, regardless of like my intent, right? How can I? And so I guess it's a question, right? Which is, how can I, as an old guy, and maybe just being in the room alone with me, I could imagine would make some people feel uncomfortable. And to be honest, I do try as much as possible to keep my door open whenever I've got students in the room. Because I think, just as a general matter of practice, unless there's a good reason for me to close my office door, I don't close my office door. Or rather, unless there's a good reason to close it, it should be open. Yeah. But, okay, sometimes a student might come in, and it's happened in the past. Maybe they're crying. Maybe they're upset about something. Maybe they have something to talk about that is personal. And that's part of our job. So how can I ensure that doesn't make somebody feel uncomfortable? Because basically what you're saying is, if it does make you feel uncomfortable, regardless of my intention, then...
Yeah, but I think, see, in your case, right, you're very consciously and intentionally making people feel welcomed, and you're very, very conscious and making, like, an actual effort to make female or male students feel that they're not being in an uncomfortable position. But if it were to happen, but not everyone is like you, right? Some people don't really even think about that. Like, I think for majority of men, I think they don't really think about themselves like in that position that, oh, how would I make this person feel? Or if I do something, is it going to make them feel uncomfortable? But let's say if someone did feel uncomfortable, would you rather them say it out like right up, like up front?
Yeah, of course. If somebody said to me up front, this makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then that's fine. But I can imagine how that would be really difficult.
But would you feel offended if someone is like, but you're not having an intention to make them uncomfortable, and then they just say something like that?
I wouldn't feel offended.
Okay.
I might be a little bit alarmed. Okay. I'll have an example to share with you. I had a student one time who brought an issue to my attention. Now, the student was on a trip. Yeah, they were dealing with somebody in a different culture. The person that they were dealing with from another culture, they were in the airport. There was a man, and they were taking a group picture. When they took the group picture in the airport, it was a man with a group of people, touched the student on her back, kind of put his hand on her back when they took the picture. And later in the evening, the student called me to report that had made her feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So, in my opinion, that was a situation where there was it was a large group, it was a public space. I don't think there was any intention on the part of the individual who put
for sure
his hand on her back. And that's a difficult situation, right? So how do we manage those? Because it wasn't a situation where the woman felt comfortable saying to him, hey, stop that.
Yeah.
And I imagine, if you're there with a group of people, that would be quite difficult, right?
It would be, because especially if you're going on a trip together, like you don't want to start off on the wrong foot. You're like, I understand, like, it is a difficult position. So what would you do, Samantha? How would you deal with a situation like that?
This is a difficult scenario. I don't think this is a kind of gender discrimination because this is a group activity and it's even in a public space. This depends on the person. If I face such a girl reporting to me, I would bring the girl and the male together, speak all the things out, try to clarify the situation, asking the guy, why are you doing that? Or it's just showing the cohesion within the group. Hopefully it can help the girl to think about it deeper and know that the guy is not consciously putting the hands on her back and having any mature behavior on her.
I think I will handle it a bit differently. So I wouldn't bring in a third person. I feel like I would just keep it. First of all, I think I would react on the spot because I'm a Muslim, right? And I can't make like hand or like physical touch with the opposite gender. So usually if I see someone, it happens like a lot of times, like we'll go in, they'll come in for a handshake and I'll be like, I'm so sorry, I'm Muslim, I can't shake your hand. And I would just resolve it right away. And so I feel like the group picture thing, if it were happened to me, I'll be like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, but then if if I can't use my religion as like the reason why I can't do it, but if it's just a personal preference, I would still, I feel like, take the same approach. I'll be like, oh, sorry, or like, you know, just move away for a second. Like, what do you guys think about that? And then I think that will set a boundary that they're like, oh, she's not comfortable like being held or something. What do you think?
I think that, I mean, and in fact, the situation was where the person who had touched lives in a country, in a different country.
Yeah.
And the person who was touched was a Muslim woman.
Oh, okay.
It was a young,
yeah.
she was a high school.
Yeah.
She was a young Muslim woman in high school. Mm-hmm. So that does kind of like give context. And it was entirely a situation where, and I believe 100% that, you know, I know the person who had done the touching.
Yeah.
I've worked with them for a long time, and I know that there was no ill intent.
It was definitely a cultural thing.
Yeah. So, but it's it was a cultural thing. And they were on a kind of global cultural exchange. It was a situation where the only time that they were even going to be together was that one trip. So they wouldn't ever have to see each other again in the future.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned intent, right? I think the intention part is very important. Although sometimes it's not easy to tell what people's intentions are, but as girls, I think we kind of have like a sixth sense about it. Sometimes we can pick up on these like signals. If someone's having a friendly intention or if it's like more than that.
In some situation.
But okay, so let me ask you this then. Do you feel like there's a potential that there's opportunities that you miss because of the danger that exists for a person like me? In other words, okay, let's say, and I do a lot of experiential learning, right? And so I'm often in the field with my students. Yeah. I would be okay to ask a male student to go to lunch with me in general. To be honest, I would be much less comfortable to ask a female student to go to lunch with me. Yeah?
Yeah.
Does that then disadvantage you as a female student? Because I have to be cautious. And I have to be cautious, right?
Yeah,
because
for sure.
If I'm the best person in the world, right, you could come into my office and if the door was closed, if anything were to transpire that made you feel uncomfortable, that could be really serious. There could be really serious consequences.
Puts you on a disadvantage, right? Of course, 100%. So,
So does it leave you then at a disadvantage? And is there kind of like, can our awareness of not wanting to make other people feel uncomfortable actually contribute to the inequality?
Now I'm thinking inequality in that sense, like you mentioned, maybe going out for lunch is kind of like a non-academic setting, right?
And it's a socializing event.
Yeah, but then also most not most, but a lot of times when people get some like opportunities, sometimes it's not necessarily coming from an academic setting. Like maybe for you to build like a good relationship with like a teacher or like a professor, it's useful, right? But sometimes it's not necessarily just from the lecture halls. So that's what I'm thinking about. Like in an academic setting, I didn't ever feel like I'm left out, right? Because I feel like I have the same opportunities, same equality, same chance to speak, same chance to walk up to the professor. But like going out for lunch and stuff, I have done it with professors, but in a group setting, never one-on-one. So I'm not sure.
And I would kind of, I wouldn't feel as worried about going to lunch with with a group. Mm-hmm. But just to kind of for context, I as a teacher, I don't like every day just go into a class here on campus and say, hey, who wants to go to lunch with me today? But when I'm taking students abroad for 8 weeks.
Yeah.
And that's a situation where now the student is outside their comfort zone. Those opportunities to kind of sit with the student alone and say, hey, how's it going in your placement? Right? Because they're living there. That can be really important, right? To kind of help me understand their situation, to give them voice, to give them, to help them be heard. And students don't, I don't know. Are they disadvantaged?
But do you think female teachers have the same concern when it comes to going out? Like, do you know of any of the cases like that, going out with like their male students?
My guess is maybe not. And again, it's this situation because I'm a person with privilege. I mean, kind of as you go through the world as a white male, especially in Asia, where there's so much privilege, you have to be mindful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to be mindful particularly of the kind of historical, basically, I think men get a bad rap with cause. I don't want to say like, okay, there's no root to this.
Yeah.
And so we have to be mindful of that. And maybe women don't. I don't.
Maybe they have it easier in that sense.
And maybe, in fact, maybe the kind of work that I do is more difficult for women because, again, it's like I am spending a lot of time in places alone that some of my female colleagues may, coming back to that job that you mentioned, right? It's kind of that same situation where if the job requires that you go off to a small village in Myanmar by yourself, is that something that, and I hope that, I hope that my female colleagues would feel just as comfortable doing that as I do.
Yeah. I think there's no right answer in this situation, but I think it just reminds me of this thing, that gender equality versus equity. Am I saying that right? So it's like, have you guys seen that picture that's like equality versus equity? It's like, it's not to give everyone the same opportunities, but to let people have the same
accessibility.
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe what education, like what people should be doing, like you said, like Myanmar opportunities and stuff, it's not to say, okay, both girls and guys can apply for this, but making sure that girls that are applying for this are going to feel safe. Okay, you're going to have like a safe environment there. You're not going to have to worry about this and that. It makes me think about that.
Can I create a safe environment?
Yeah, for sure. I think the fact that you're conscious about it is already like better than like so many other people.
Okay, I mean, because another situation that came up, same kind of program, right? And I had a group of women, 3 women. They were traveling to their workplace, and on the bus, they were touched as they were going to the school where they were teaching in a foreign country. And they were very upset about this. They went to the school. They talked about it at the school where they were teaching, and they didn't feel like it was kind of treated with adequate seriousness. And then I went to the school and I talked to them for a long time, and we probably spent 3 hours, and I think it was very useful because clearly they just needed to be heard, but there was nothing that we could do other than kind of help them find other arrangements other than riding the bus.
Yeah.
Were the people unknown?
They were unknown people on a public bus.
So under what circumstance the guys touched them?
They were taking public transport. The women were taking public transportation in a foreign city. And while they were taking this public transportation, somebody touched them on a crowded bus.
Were there many people?
I think it was a crowded bus. And so then they had to get off the bus.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a situation beyond my capacity to control, other than to say to the women, okay, well, we'll have to find, if you're uncomfortable being on the bus, then we can find alternate ways to get you back and forth to work, which ended up costing more money to take a Grab.
Mm.
But, what do we do in that situation?
Yeah, it's so hard because that depends on the perception of individuals. In the crowded bus, it's unavoidable that other people may touch you because this is a case that we can hardly handle. But it's still understandable that the three women feel uncomfortable.
Because I'm thinking it's regardless, because it happened outside of let's say the academic institution, it's not really in control of them. But I mean, for example, for you to do your part to provide them with alternative ways to travel or take care of them in that way, it's very good. But I also think sometimes things that happen outside the institution is really as people, whether you're a girl or a boy, you have to watch out for yourself. You have to look out for yourself, right? So it's yeah, maybe because I'm traveling with the school, I'm gonna expect them to look out for me. But if I were in a real life scenario, if I'm traveling on my own, who am I gonna go back to? That is an unpleasant experience. But I don't think it has to do with workplace discrimination, right?
It's a difficult
It's
dilemma
heavy,
because, and for me as a kind of being in charge of the program, sending them to that school, now I have an obligation. If they complain and if they don't feel comfortable being on the bus, then I feel like I have an obligation. Whereas, to be honest, and I kind of think through that same scenario, if it was my daughter, if it was my daughter, I don't think I would have gotten her the alternate transport. I
I understand.
If it was my daughter, I kind of think I would take your viewpoint, which is, okay, look, you got to deal with this because you can't. I don't want you to be a person who's afraid to go out in the world. I want you to be a person who can go out into the world, who can feel comfortable. And as a woman, you're going to experience this. So what are we going to do?
But if it was a company driver, then the case would be totally different, right?
100%,
Because then it's
100%,
inside.
100%. If it was a company driver, then, we would need to resolve that.
Then it's directly workplace related discrimination or harassment.
Yeah. That would be a totally different situation. But it also, I guess the question is, as a woman, there does exist that problem. Women are smaller in general, right? And so that just the kind of the physical imbalance puts women at a disadvantage. And so, when you go into that kind of environment where, people are more likely to prey upon women when you're traveling alone.
How did you deal with the issue for the three women?
In that instance, we arranged for them to begin to take a car. So they would, instead of taking the public bus, they spent the rest of the time they took a Grab rather than the bus.
So they reported the issue during the trip?
They reported it immediately when they got to the school. The school, they felt didn't spend enough time trying to resolve the issue. In truth, it was for the local school, they felt terrible.
For sure, yeah.
But they weren't sure how to deal with it because I think they were yeah, that's what happens on buses here. And so for them, it was just what are we going to do? But the girls were much more traumatized by it.
For sure, yeah.
And they didn't feel like the school was very sensitive. Spent 3 hours listening to them, resolved most of the problem, but then we did put them onto a Grab. So that they were just kind of doing a Grab car for the rest of the time.
That was a very fruitful conversation. Let's take a short break and come back with our second case.
Welcome back to the episode. In the second part, we will talk about agenda discrimination from the men's perspective. When it comes to applying for jobs, just as women under the same conditions need to be more competitive for engineering positions, male applicants seem to have lower success rates when applying for administrative, nursing, and early childhood education positions. This reminds me of a male classmate of mine who studied early childhood education telling me about such stress. He said that the early childhood education work requires more patience and care, and the public generally believes that this is the characteristic of girls. So preschool education jobs tend to be more biased towards women. On the other hand, men who are engaged in early childhood education are often misunderstood and even labeled as feminine. What do you think, MJ?
I think coming from a science background, I didn't really think about what men would have to do if they were in like that position. So when I imagine like a kindergarten teacher, like a very strong female comes in my head. Like maybe that's just like how we were programmed to think throughout all these years. But when I think about a nurse, on the other hand, it's not such a strong image that it has to be a female, you know? So I definitely see how this kind of stereotypes exists. And even if as university students that we tend to think that we are very open-minded, unconsciously, we kind of follow these stereotypes as well.
So from this general phenomenon, society seems to set up a gender segregation with few men or even no men by default for doing the caring jobs. But do you think this situation is getting improving nowadays?
I think, for example, we would think that it's improving, but I haven't heard of any significant breakthroughs recently. I mean, on my 20 years being alive, so...
But is it something that we perceive to be a problem at the same level? Because if we think about the issue of women not being allowed to be engineers, if we think about the issue of women being locked out of STEM, we all agree that's a problem. Yeah. But if we talk about men being locked out from early childhood education, or men being discriminated against in careers like nursing, do we perceive that to be a problem of the same magnitude? Or maybe do we perceive that to be a problem at all?
I think when it comes to the public, they definitely, like you mentioned, I think majority of the public wouldn't put as much emphasis on the male perspective, the male side, right? But then when it comes to gender equality, like you have to think about it. There is actually a real person who is suffering from this type of a guy who's passionate. This is his career choice and he can't do it. And he feels equally as bad as a woman who wants to be like an engineer who can't do it, you know? So I feel like maybe from a social perspective, people don't really, like they're underrepresented maybe. But when it comes to like equality and when it comes to the conversation, we definitely have to consider them on the same level, in my opinion.
Do you know what I mean? Is it the same? I mean, we can say, okay, they should have the same equality. Mm-hmm. And but there's lots and lots of organizations out there doing work to try to open doors in STEM for women, right? And a lot of companies might even, I know of specific companies that have CSR programs designed around bringing women into STEM. Mm-hmm. As far as I know, I haven't heard of any programs kind of trying to resolve the opposite problem of what fields are men being locked out of.
Yeah.
And is it just that, is it that, childhood education is not lucrative?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's sort of like, the fields that are historically women, that women dominate tend to be fields that, don't get as much respect. Right. So it's like, university education, maybe men are not underrepresented, but early childhood education, okay, well, do you know what I mean? It's not as good. Mm-hmm. So is that, in the same way, it's like, okay, it's a problem if women don't become doctors. Mm-hmm. And we would all agree, okay, if there's not enough women doctors, that's a problem. If there's not enough male nurses, do we all agree that's a problem?
I think as a society, like you mentioned, probably people don't see it as such a big problem. But then when you think about it, like just take a step back and think about it. Why is it that we have to make little kids associate the nurturing feeling with just women? Why can't they grow up having more male teachers as well? Like, we have to think as a society, like why do we think this way? Why do we think that we're so okay with females taking up this nurturing position, and we're not concerned about, well, I don't know, in a sense it just like reinforces toxic masculinity, like all of that, you know?
As we start to talk about those traits, I wonder if part of the problem that we run into is that the traits tend to kind of start to touch into issues of sexuality. Mm-hmm. So being nurturing, for example, yeah, is that often, as you know, we associate being nurturing with femininity. So is there a sense that I don't want my son to be sensitive because that's gay, right? And do a lot of parents then begin to kind of attach characteristics with sexual orientation, and does that lead to this kind of, you know, our parents actually discouraging boys from being nurturing?
So this is the gender stereotype, and it's about cultural issues. Because most often we think about women would stay at home caring for children and doing all the things of the housework. For earning the income from the outside, it should be the responsibility for the male, but not the women. This is a phenomenon that requires us to reflect. I think this is also the government's responsibility to encourage the company to be more open-minded, to even open the positions for the women who are having the babies but wanted to go back to the workplace.
But what are you guys' opinion on government mandatory like positions to be filled by female and males? Like, for example, they'll be like, okay, in every kindergarten you have to have equal number of female and male like teachers, and then as a nurse place also like same equal number female nurse and male nurse. Like, what do you guys think about that? Because I feel like whenever something like this is brought up, people like to bring up the argument that, oh, then maybe they wouldn't recruit the best of the talents because they're recruiting the woman just to fill the woman position, but maybe they're not the best of the best. But as in like a corporate world, they're gonna recruit the highest talents regardless of like their gender, and that's why we have more male, because they tend to be better at this position than this. Like, so what do you guys think about that? Do you think having a mandatory quota to fill is something that could be useful in this discussion?
I think this can be a good initiative to promote the gender equality in terms of the number of the positions filled by the male and the female in the workplace. But it can be not a one-off step. We can gradually increasing the number of the male or female in filling the positions. But if we really want to recruit the best of the best to fill in the positions, I think the main point is to consider their qualification equally, but not focus on the thing that the same number of the positions should be filled by male or female.
But we're really talking about, okay, you talked about internal bias, right? And then policies. And so there's this kind of core problem. And it comes back to the first question that you asked, which was, why does it have to be this way? Why do we have to have these perceptions that attach characteristics to gender? And I guess the answer is it doesn't have to be that way, but it is that way, right? And it is that way because people have these thoughts, right? This is what people have, these beliefs. So is the policy then designed, is it meant to try to prevent us from having these beliefs, right? And will a policy change my perspectives? If I'm biased against women, will a policy change that?
In a sense, is it just a quick fix? But it's not actually like
a long-term way to go.
Yeah, or like it's not addressing the root cause or the root issue.
And that's a good question, right? And I mean, because I also think, you know, when we talked about the issue of like women in the workplace, and then women historically are discriminated against because the perception is they need to take care of the children. So they need to, they're not as good at work, right? But the reality is, I mean, is it the problem that there's this perception that that's the woman's role, and so we should discriminate against them at work, when maybe is the problem that men should be helping more to take care of the babies, right? And if men were more involved with parenting, then would that would that bias not need to exist?
But also, I have another point. Have you guys heard about these research that have come out? So it's actually proven that in a company setting or like in a corporate setting, the companies that have more balanced gender ratio, like male to female ratio employees, as well as gender diverse, like ethnic diversity and gender diversity, these companies tend to do significantly better than a company that is predominantly having the same representation within the company. So then it makes me think, like an earlier point that you mentioned, is it all just about money? If it's beneficial for us financially to have a more diverse, like sexual or gender or ethnic like workforce, it's good for us. We're going to make more money. Sure, I'm going to follow that. But if it doesn't really matter for us, like if it's better for us to just have female kindergarten teachers, it gets the job done, it's good for us, good enough, then we're not going to take any initiative. So is it all just about money?
No. Because as we can see, diversity is integrated into the recruitment process nowadays in the companies like Prologies, Goldman Sachs, no matter accounting firms or law firms, companies of all sizes, they're welcoming people from different gender identities, different sexual orientations to apply for jobs. I think the companies are now committed to evaluating their potential equally.
It doesn't the whole reason why there is CSR programs, because it's good for making money, right? So companies are not developing CSR programs because they genuinely care about society. They're developing CSR programs because that's a nice thing to market, right? And their CSR is developed to help promote their own image.
Right.
So it's
the
ultimately about
reputation.
making money, right? And I think companies that's why they exist, for the singular purpose in general, unless it's a nonprofit. A company exists for the singular purpose of making money.
Well, how about we look at it from this way? Let's say a male nurse in this scenario. He did get recruited into his dream job, career, and he's ready to go. But there's this case that I just talked to my female nurse friend, and I asked her, do you think that there is a different treatment between male nurses and female nurses within the workplace? And what she told me is that often female nurses are assigned to both male and female patients. But for male nurses, they are more often assigned to male nurses exclusively, especially when it comes to the tasks that are more invasive treatments. So now it makes me think, maybe, of course, they're thinking about whether the patient is comfortable with a male nurse performing something that's invasive on them. But but do you think that is like inequality on behalf of the nurse? Do you think it's kind of not fair to the nurse to be limited to more of a male patient?
The general phenomenon that we can see quite a lot of female nurses doing caring jobs. So when we have a large number of female nurses, then we have to distribute some of them to take care of the male patient.
My friend told me that although she's more immune to it now, but sometimes it does make her uncomfortable to perform some of the procedures on the male patients, right? But also, of course, and doing the same thing for a male nurse to do it on a female patient, it will make him uncomfortable as well to a certain extent. But for the female nurse to have to be exposed to that more often, to that uncomfortable feeling more often than a male nurse being subjected to that, to me, I feel like on one hand, it's unfair to the female nurse. On the other hand, it's unfair to the male nurse because he's not being given the same job duties.
But so when you first described the inequality in terms of duty assignment, it sounded to me like the reason was because the patients have this discomfort. And you could look at that from the perspective of the nurse and say, okay, well, the female nurses have to do more work now. But doesn't that also limit, for the male nurse, their professional viability?
Their experiences, right?
Yeah,
how much they get to learn.
How much, and how employable they are. Because if I run a hospital now, if men make half of my patients feel uncomfortable, then a male nurse is less useful than a female nurse.
Yeah.
And must be, like, if I'm going to make a decision based entirely then upon how can I deploy that person, then I would likely discriminate against
A male nurse.
a male nurse. I mean, I think it's all a very interesting kind of conversation to have, and it's really, I think it's been like really great to get different perspectives.
As an institution, as a company, they have to ensure that there is a kind of safe space for people to be able to talk about these things without having to worry, oh, how is this going to affect my job?
Long-term perspectives. It is important to cultivate people, especially from they're very young, from the family education and from the school's education.
In a sense, it sounds cliche, but everything starts from you. It's you as an individual making an effort to be mindful, to do research, to do your part in making people comfortable. And also follow us on our social media to keep the conversation going. Let us know what you think about this episode in the comments. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.